So we're going to view what the difference is between a genotype and a phenotype. In order to understand what genotype and phenotype is, first let's imagine we have two macaws, and these macaws, one will be red and one will be blue. And if a macaw is red, we will call that a dominant trait. So we'll represent that with the capital C letter here. And then if it's a blue macaw, we'll call that a recessive trait. So we'll give it a lowercase c. All right, just to remember how Mendel's law works, we're going to look into the Punnett square. And remember that if we have a recessive gene as a result, or as the trait that can be seen, then we have a bird that has to have both its alleles as the recessive gene. In the case of the dominant trait, it can appear when I have a bird with a mixture of the dominant and the recessive, or either just the dominant. In this case, just for an example, I decided to put the mixture of both here, but as you can see, you have resulting birds, or resulting sunbirds, or offspring, sorry is the right word, offspring with different sorts of genes. And these genes depend on what the parents, let's say, passed on to the birds. So this is what we're going to need to know, or this is what we're going to talk about when we talk about phenotypes and genotypes. Exactly what type of offspring do we get from this combination of these two birds? This obviously can happen with any trait that we need to following Mendel's law, that follows Mendel's law. So now we're going to talk about phenotype. We already said that when we have a bird that has both its genes as dominant, we get the dominant trait, which in this case is a red bird. We can also get a red bird when I combine the dominant trait with a recessive trait. The dominant trait will prevail, and you will obtain a red bird. Last but not least, you can have a blue bird, but the blue bird, since it's recessive, it's mandatory that both the genes that the bird has be the recessive gene, and that's how you obtain a blue bird. So basically, when somebody asks you what the phenotype of a trait is the resulting physical traits you can see. So, for example, in this case, the phenotype of these birds, of this trait, of the color of the bird, is either red or blue. That's it. The genotype basically tells you what the genes are within that living being. So let's take into account once again just the color of the macaw. And we have a couple of possibilities once again. If I have a macaw that has in both, or as both of his genes, the dominant red, then we will have this red macaw. So we can say that they're the same gene. Since they're the same gene, we call him homozygous because he has the same genes in both of his alleles. Okay. So, if that's what happens with the same genes, well, let's now compare what happens when you have different genes. So, here we have the dominant trait, and we have the recessive trait. So, when we have a bird that has both those traits at the same time, we say that that bird is heterozygous, at least in his color. Okay? So, this last one, once again, regardless of it being the recessive gene, they are both the same. So we call him also homozygous. So remember, homozygous or heterozygous has to do with the fact that if the genes are the same or if they're different. Now there's one more little thing we have to take into account. Heterozygous birds can only have different genes, and since there's only two at a time, there's no other way. But homozygous genes can have either both the dominant or both the recessive. So we give them one extra name when they're homozygous. So if they're homozygous and have the dominant gene, we say they're homozygous dominant. If they're homozygous but have the recessive gene, we call them homozygous recessive. In the case of heterozygous, we don't need, or actually we can't say if they're dominant or recessive because they have both. So that's why we don't add that extra name to it. So it's that simple. The genotype is telling you what the genes are. It doesn't tell you the color. In the phenotype, we said this guy was red, and this guy was blue. But as a genotype, we say if they have the same or different genes, and if they have the different genes, if they have the same gene, if that same gene is dominant or if that same gene is recessive. It's that simple. So just to recap, basically the genotype is telling you what's in the genes of the living being, okay, which we already talked about. And the phenotype is telling you what the physical trait or the physical outcome will be from those genes. So in this case, once again, phenotype, we only have two, red and blue. But genotype, we can have various depending on the combinations. We can have homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive.